This article on why eat a low oxalate diet has been on the site. I thought I would burnish it with a video that I could use to bring out the main points and maybe make the article ring a little bit louder and a little bit truer. The beautiful painting by Raphael hangs in the Musée Conti in Chantilly, and it depicts the three great goddesses who started the Trojan War. One of them is Hera, the wife of Zeus. One of them is Athene, the goddess of justice and of war and battle and honor. The third is Aphrodite, the goddess of love. They encountered Hector's brother, poor Paris, and demanded that he award the golden apple, there should have really been only one, to the most beautiful of the three. Now, that is a ridiculous thing for them to do because they're shape changers. They could have looked any way they wished, and it would be impossible for him to choose the best one. They're all perfectly gorgeous. At any rate, he chose among the three. Hera promised him power. After all, she's the wife of the main god. Athene promised him bravery and valor and a sense of justice. And Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful woman in the world to be his lover. Guess who he chose? He chose the woman. Aphrodite cast a spell over Helen, who was married to Menelaus. They eloped to Troy. As far as the Greeks were concerned, it was an abduction, and that's the Trojan War. You might say, why did I put it here? Well, because there are three things, and he had to choose one. And I'm going to talk about three things, too. So it's all about why you need a low oxalate diet, how low does it have to be, and how do you know? I suppose the easiest place to start is right here. Do your stones contain calcium oxalate? They may be calcium phosphate. If there's little or no calcium oxalate, the urine oxalate itself is not a problem. Let's say your stones are uric acid. Don't worry about oxalate particularly. Especially, what if they're struvite? What if they're cysteine? Wrong problem. Now let's say your stones do contain calcium oxalate crystals. How much? Traces? You could read this yourself. Above 10 or 20%, okay. Consider oxalate a problem if it's high enough to raise your risk of stones. Now, let's open a parenthesis here. If you don't know what crystals make up your stones, find out. Take the stones out of your drawer and send them for analysis. Whatever the crystals are, you need to know them. If everything fails, you don't have any stones, your reports are all lost, okay. Guess and figure it's calcium oxalate. But we already have a rather weak platform. The next big question. Is your 24-hour urine oxalate high enough that you need to care about it? This is work by Gary Curhan. I love his work. The graph here shows relative risk of being in a stone-forming as opposed to a not stone-forming group. This is a group of women and of men followed for many years. Some made stones. Control patients were gathered to match them. 24-hour urines were done. This shows ranges of urine oxalate in milligram per day. This shows relative risk of being in the stone-forming group. This is 1. From 25 to 29 milligram of oxalate, the mean relative risk is something like 2.5-fold. The bottom of this bar is the lower 95th percentile, which means it's very unlikely that the value is just 1. By 30 to 39, the relative risk has been sort of steady, actually. By 40 to 49, it's from about 2 something to as high as 3 something. And then only the men went as high as 50. So from this, you get some sense that urine oxalate's a graded risk factor, broadly speaking, in men and women. And you better have urine oxalate in the range of 25 to 29 milligram a day if you really think you're going to have increased risk from oxalate and therefore be bothered with lowering the urine oxalate in the first place. This little squibbit here could use a paraphrase. Just because your urine oxalate's 35 or 40, if your stones are all calcium phosphate, don't assume the high oxalate means you have to lower it. If your stones are all uric acid, likewise. It's when your stones are unknown to you and you guess they're calcium oxalate, or when you know they're calcium oxalate, that you really want to take action. Now, the first step is not the diet oxalate list. The first step is to raise your diet calcium. Here, I'm repeating material that is in another article, and that article has its own video. I'm only doing that here because I want to integrate the diet calcium oxalate story with the larger story that you're hearing and that you will hear. So I'm going to repeat in a brief form here what you could read in a better form if you clicked on that link. What does this graph show? It shows urine oxalate in milligram per day on this axis. It shows diet calcium in milligram per day on this axis. These are experiments. These various investigators, who I've named, changed the calcium intake of people and measured the effect on urine oxalate with different oxalate intakes. The littlest would be 50 milligram a day. The largest is 200, and the ones in between would be 100. More or less across the board, the higher calcium, up to about 1,000, 1,200 milligram a day, brings the urine oxalate down, so it tends to be in the range of 25 to 35. 1,200 milligram of calcium a day is considered an ideal for the American people. Certainly 1,000 milligram would be your basic starting diet. The lower diets, which seem awful for oxalate, are very close to the average calcium intake of American people today, and they're regrettably low. So by raising the diet calcium, you are doing good in terms of bone health, and as I will show you in just a minute, with a special countermeasure, you will offset the effect of the higher diet calcium and not raise stone risk. I'm not going to read you this intervening text. What it says is what I just said, and it says it should come from food. In other words, when you eat foods with calcium, they're absorbed like foods are absorbed, and it works better. If you just can't stand dairy products that have calcium, you can use supplements. To use supplements, you have to take them with your meals, and they do special good if you take them with the meals that are likely to contain oxalate. No meal, it's a waste of time. I promised you a counterpoise to that extra diet calcium, and here it is. One of the major things that we've learned over the last 50 years about urine calcium in stone disease. This is urine calcium in milligram per day. This is urine sodium in milliequivalent per 24 hour. These are people without stones. These are people who form calcium stones because they have genetic hypercalciuria. Look at the difference in slopes. At 200 milligram a day, the urine calcium is vastly higher than it is in the normal people. At 100 milligram a day, the difference is disappearing. At 50 to 60 milliequivalent per day, which is the ideal American sodium intake, the two graphs come together. So, if you drop the diet sodium from the typical American average of whatever, 150 to 250 milliequivalent a day, down below 100 milliequivalent a day, you will bring the urine calcium down, and that will offset the high calcium intake. When you eat more calcium and you drop the sodium and you bring the calcium in the urine down, where do you think the calcium goes? I know where it goes, at least from the one first-rate experiment that's been done to date. It goes into bone. The combination of low sodium, high calcium diet is definitely good for bone, and it will let you block a lot of oxalate absorption with high calcium in your diet. Now this next part of the article is a little bit of a rant. Now I don't need to read the rant to you. You can read it yourself. What I'm simply saying is low oxalate diet is not easier and it's not better. But rather rant, I'll let you read it. I want to turn to a critical study that I have reviewed elsewhere, and I'm reviewing it again. Here, men with hypercalciuria and calcium oxalate stones were treated with a relatively low diet calcium of 400 milligram a day or 1200 milligram a day. This was low sodium. They tried to get below 100 milliequivalent. They didn't quite succeed. This was ambient, which is about 200 milliequivalents of sodium. This is the cumulative incidence of new calcium oxalate stones. See what happened. At the end of 5 years, the urine volumes were about the same. The urine sodium was much lower because they got the diet made that way. The urine calciums were virtually identical, even though the one group was eating 3 times more calcium than the other. This is 1200. That's 400. But the urine calciums are the same. These are milliequivalent per day. You have to multiply that out by 40 to get milligram per day. What's interesting is the oxalate. The oxalate came down by about 25%. And that lowered the supersaturation. You can see that right away. So the trick works. It's excellent. And that's basically what I'm suggesting that you do. So now we have almost all the parts in place. You have calcium oxalate stones. Your urine oxalate was high enough at the beginning, of 25 to 29 milligram per day, that you want to do something. We have to now add the something you would do is to raise your diet calcium to 1,000, 1,200 milligram a day, drop your diet sodium to 100 milliequivalent a day or less, and recheck the urine oxalate. Let's say it is now under 25 to 29 milligram a day. I say you're done. Let us say it is not. Let's say it's still 25 to 29 milligram per day or higher. Then you need to control your diet oxalate. What level? In the trial here, the one I just parsed out for you, the diet oxalate was 200 milligram a day. I say 200 milligram a day would be reasonable. However, a very wonderful authority on oxalate, Ross Holmes, thinks that's a bit high, even in including perhaps such precautions as a high calcium intake and all that. And he'd be in favor of 100. And I'm splitting the difference. I say 100 to 200 milligram a day. Okay. That would be where I would end up. So, closing out the talk, what do we have to say? Let's focus on steps that we can take. Check out the stones. Check out your basic urine oxalate. Be sure it's high enough. Do the threefold way. In other words, add the diet calcium. Drop the diet sodium. What's the third part? Check the urine again and see if the urine oxalate is still high enough to matter. Above 25 to 29 milligram per day. If it is, absolutely drop the oxalate intake, use the list, and do some good for yourself. You might say to me, why did you show me the 3 goddesses besides to entertain me? It's because of the threefold plan. Higher diet calcium, lower diet sodium, moderate diet oxalate. That's why. I'm Fred Coe. Thanks a lot for reading the article, for being here, and listening to this video.